Hello everyone, and welcome back to another short lecture on writing an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Today I'm going to talk about the analytical framework. As usual, we start with a reminder on the structure of that framework, actually where it is positioned within the overall structure of our master's thesis or term papers. Then I move through main functions, what you have to do, examples, and so on. And I conclude with a few remarks on how this component will be graded. As you see here, the analytical framework is still in the theoretical part. It's the final section of the theoretical part, and three of the main points are also highlighted here in red. The main functions of the analytical framework. Well, first of all, this is your action plan. You have decided on your topic. You have decided on your research question. You have read a lot so that you now know what has happened in the field. You know some of the available options, discussions. You see how other people have approached your topic or a similar topic or a related topic. And now, as a result of that literature review, you are going to come up with your own approach to answer your research question. The analytical framework therefore includes all the single tasks that you will have to perform and also their order, and in a way also the interrelation. The analytical framework is enormously important. It's like a compass that helps you to navigate this sea of the vast number of information and data out there. It tells you what kind of information and data to look for and where to actually put it once you have found it. It also helps you to decide whether information, data, again, depending on your topic, whether that is really relevant for your research or not. And this is enormously important because sometimes this is very hard to decide while you are actually doing your empirical research, because you will encounter all these interesting and exciting facts, and then very often it happens that people kind of get lost in all this and include stuff that doesn't really help them much in answering their specific research question. So a good analytical framework will serve as kind of a guiding light and help you to focus on what you need to do and avoid things that might be interesting but do not necessarily belong into this particular work of yours. The analytical framework in a structural sense also provides the substructure of the empirical part. So like section 1, 2, 3, 4 of the empirical part, they should basically be named after the criteria that you have listed in your analytical framework. So in a way, it's also a help in structuring the remainder of your master's thesis or term paper. So what do? You either find a complete analytical framework in one of the publications you have read in your literature review, and then you use it for your own research. This is an ideal situation. It's actually relatively rare depending on your topic. You're much more likely to go for option number 2. That is, you create your own analytical framework out of the single contributions that you found in your literature review. So it's kind of an eclectic approach, meaning pulling together ideas and criteria, etc., from various sources, not just one framework that you copy one-on-one. Of course, there would also be kind of 1A option, as taking an existing framework and modifying it a little bit. Perhaps I should also mention that. What's important is, and I'm going to repeat this a couple of times to make sure that this is really clear to everybody, in the analytical framework, you can only refer to sources and information and ideas that you have discussed in your literature review. You should not add new sources here. If you find a new source that you think it needs to be discussed for your analytical framework, perfectly fine. But then enter it somewhere in the literature review. This is where it belongs, so that you then can refer to it. Okay. The analytical framework is a list of analytical criteria according to which you intend to collect information to answer your research question, as I just said also on the previous slide. The thing is that these criteria need to be based on what you have read and discussed in the literature review. Okay, that is really, really important. And also you need to be able, and you should actually do that, explain the origin and function of each of those criteria. Why is that so? Number one, because it kind of gives authority to your framework. And secondly, it makes sure that you do not use those criteria in the wrong context, because some of the models that you will find during reading the literature, they are kind of conditional. So there are certain criteria included there, but they only make sense if they are either seen in a particular way, if data is collected in a particular fashion, or if they are used together with a number of other criteria, right? So that is really, really important. Sometimes you might even find mutually exclusive criteria. So you have two very different approaches to a phenomenon. In that case, you cannot really combine them into one framework. That's why it is really important that you not just copy the single ideas, but also understand them, their origins, and the side conditions that would actually apply to those criteria. And that's what I want to see also in the analytical framework. So you have to demonstrate that. I mean, I'm not talking about like writing 10 pages on every criterion. You can easily refer to the literature review if you like, but you know, having a paragraph of two on each criterion would actually be very useful, showing that you really understand what you're actually doing, especially when you operate with an eclectic framework. That's point number 2 here on top of this slide, okay? If you choose those criteria, every single one of them, but also in their entirety, like the combination of those criteria, I want to see and understand and believe you, after reading what you've written, that you made an informed decision, that you know what you do, right? I do not want to see arbitrary decisions. Of course, I will never know whether it's arbitrary, but I don't want to get the impression, right, that this decision has been made kind of out of the blue, like you stumbled over something, found it nice, stopped reading and said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. In that case, and this is why I usually also discourage students from already telling us in the introduction, like the first few pages of your paper or thesis, which approach you want to use. This is something that you could kind of leave as a surprise for the leader. You know, think of a linear logic again. You tell us what you want to do, you tell us why you want to do it, you tell us what others have done, and then as a conclusion, you tell us how you want to approach your topic. Telling us like at the very beginning how you want to approach it, and then going through the literature review, that's kind of boring, you know, it's kind of the result coming before the actual process that leads to it. So please avoid that. Okay. The other thing that's important is measurement. Now you see I put measure in quotation marks here because that is not necessarily related to actual numbers. Measuring could be yes or no, or present or absent, or something like that. But in any case, you have to have a way of measuring. You need to tell me what kind of information you actually want to find for each criterion, and in what sense we actually talk about information here, right? Are you looking for specific formulations in policies, or are you looking for a certain threshold when it comes to values of something? Or are you working more qualitatively? Like, do you look whether there is anything on that criterion at all? And if so, is it affirmative or not? You know, again, difficult to say that in general terms because it really depends on your topic. But it's really important that you, in your analytical framework, for each criterion, kind of explain to me what exactly you are looking for in terms of measurement, right? You can collect your own primary data, for example, through interviews, surveys, experiments, whatever, or you can use existing data. These would be statistics or secondary literature and so on and so on. Right? Again, the origin and function of each of these elements have to be explained to make sure that this combination actually makes sense, and also to show that you are aware of the implication of using those criteria. You should also discuss the pros and cons of each criterion, as well as ways to acquire the necessary empirical information. I will show you a little example in a minute. So that the analytical framework usually ends with a table that lists all the single criteria, sub-criteria, and also the way how you intend to measure them and where you think you can get data from. Okay, so we return to our example of buying a mobile phone. That's your topic. Your research question is which one suits my needs best. We have the relevance of the research question here. You've done the literature review, and now we arrive at the analytical framework. So you have two options. You either adopt a list of features from one of the sources you have used. That's this example of adopting an existing framework, maybe adjusting it a little bit, or you create your own table. That's the eclectic approach, right? That's how it would look like. So this is for your mobile phone, right? You have the price. You know that it is measured in euros, and you will find it from one of those websites that helps you comparing prices of various products. You also found that perhaps the size of the touchscreen matters to you. It is measured in inches, and you think you will find this information on the website of the respective manufacturer, and so on and so on. You have, for example, the dual SIM card. This can be measured by is there or is not there, like yes or no, right? And also the source would be the website of the manufacturer. Then you might, for example, think, I want to know the availability of accessories, like, I don't know, funny stuff to attach to it, kind of shells for your mobile phone, additional items that you want to combine it with. So you could, for example, define 3 different units for measurement: low availability, so-so, medium availability, or high availability. And then you could say, well, and I intend to find this on Amazon because, or any other marketplace that you like. So I think you're getting the point here, right? The units, they differ according to the criterion and also the sources. But after you've done that, your readers will actually understand pretty well what you're looking for in terms of criteria, how you think you want to compare those different mobile phones according to what unit, right? And they also have an idea where you want to find your data. They might already at this point be critical. Like, for example, if you present this in the academic community or something, or, well, in that case, I think you might present it amongst your friends. They might say, oh, you shouldn't go to Amazon, you should go to this or that marketplace. Data there is much better. They have a much broader set of mobile phone accessories and so on and so on, right? Okay. Another example that is, I think, much closer to our actual program would be choosing a master's program. That's something that all of you have done, I guess. That's why you're here. So you want to get a master's degree. That's your topic. Your research question is, which out of 3 master's programs shall I choose? Here you have the relevance of your research question. Who will benefit how from knowing the answer to your research question, right? These are just examples. Of course, this can be supplemented according to your individual preferences. The literature review in this case would be reviews about the program. Maybe you talk to alumni of the master's programs that you're interested in. You hopefully also looked at the curricula and tried to see, okay, the single components, some of them are more interesting to me than others, and so on and so on. The other critical thing here is also that you might want to weigh those criteria against each other. If you do so, that's also something that you need to indicate in your analytical framework. Like, this is really like the most important criterion, this other criterion is only kind of less importance. You might perhaps attach a value of, in terms of percent, like this criterion is worth 20% out of 100. This other criterion is worth only 5% out of 100, and so on. Again, for your analytical framework, you do exactly the same as we just discussed for the mobile phone. And on the next slide, you will see what will probably come out of this. So, am I interested in a topic? You have these yes, no, or a little bit. Will I learn something useful? Yes, no, or don't know. These are also possible options. And then you see where you get the data from. Like, am I interested? That's something you need to ask yourself. Will I learn something useful? That's, for example, you see you can combine sources here, right? You can look at the curriculum, you can talk to alumni and try to kind of compare that to your own preferences and so on. There is one highlighted in red, and I'd like to spend a bit more time talking about this on the next slide. Do I like the city where this master's program is offered? I actually think that for some of you that has been an important criterion. I mean, going to Vienna is actually a very good idea. It's a nice city. There are other very good universities that suffer from being located in a much less attractive place. Well, of course, we are not talking about the qualities of Vienna here or why you've chosen your master's program. This is just an example to show you how the analytical framework should function. And one of the problems we often have when students submit their analytical frameworks to me is that I say it's not specific enough. And this is usually the case when it includes points like, do I like the city? Because how do you want to measure that? How do you want to really make sure that you have a well-informed, you have made a very well-informed decision? And as you see here on the slide, you can actually break this down into quite a number of rather specific sub-criteria. Like, am I interested primarily in culture? Then you might, for example, look at the number of cultural facilities. Or am I interested more in the nightlife? Then you want to see, you know, is there a nightlife, and you know, how does it look like, and so on and so on. You might be a person that's really concerned about food. Believe it or not, when I lived in New York for about a year with my family, food was really a big issue, in particular in the neighborhood where I was staying. So that was really a big deal. One shouldn't really neglect that. But anyway, here it's just an example. Or crime rate, right? I mean, you don't want to live in a city where the risk of getting killed or robbed is very high. A friend of mine just left Santiago de Chile out of concerns for her personal safety. So this is, again, not just some hypothetical thing. The language spoken, right? I mean, if you're a German speaker, Vienna is fantastic because you can communicate, well, more or less, in your native language. If you're from Spain or from the US or from Korea or from China, you might have difficulties communicating in English on an everyday basis. And that also adds to the attractiveness or non-attractiveness of a particular place. So perhaps you would rather go to London or something where you get along better in English. But then, of course, the prices, for example, for housing, I haven't even included that here. They might be higher in London than in Vienna. So this is the thing, right? This is how you construct your analytical framework with your criteria. You know how to measure them. And then at the end, you put them together, and then you can make an informed decision. In some cases, some of these sub-criteria are still too broad. They might be specified even further. And this is when you actually realize, when you draw up your final analytical framework and then see the huge amount of specific criteria, that you might perhaps have to go back to square one and adjust your topic to make it more narrow, because otherwise you will end up writing a book rather than a master's thesis or a term paper. But this is why it's so important to do all this theoretical part stuff before you start looking for data. And I can only repeat that and urge you not to take the second step before the first one. That happens quite a lot, that people first of all fall in love with a certain source of information, and then they try to create an analytical framework that kind of fits the data that they found. For a PhD thesis, that might work. It just costs you another year or two and another 100 or 200 pages, but that's fine because there's usually no upper limit. But for example, for a term paper, that's absolutely deadly. So please be careful with this kind of approach. It's usually better you start with part number one, and then you do the theoretical part, and then you do your final analytical part. Okay, and here we have the grading of everything that I just told you. You see in total, we have, what's that, 7, 9, 11, 13, right? 13 points out of 72 that you get for the analytical framework. The most important part is, has it been developed based on the literature review? Like, the last thing I want to see is that you write your literature review about something and then the analytical framework appears like it has nothing to do with your literature review. That would be really bad. In that case, you will get 0 points. And that's not really something you are aiming for, I hope. Then I look at the number. Now you want to know how many? I can't tell you. Sorry. It really depends on the topic that you have chosen on your research question. I just want to see, is that really enough, or is it just 2 or 3, where I think there are at least 5 or 6 aspects more resulting from the literature review that I think you should look at in order to answer your question, right? Then the quality of the analytical criteria is something we just talked about. Are they specific enough, right? Are they explained well concerning where they come from, how they work, in what context, what the pros and cons are of those analytical criteria? This is all stuff that you get from the literature review. That's why it is so important, right, to do a good literature review with the analytical framework in your mind as kind of the result of this literature review. And then, yeah, the presentation of your analytical criteria. Some students decide against the table. That's perfectly fine. It's at least at the end of the day, it's your thesis. If you find a better way to demonstrate what you want to do, and according to the criteria that I'm looking for, that's perfectly fine. I just found that the table usually is the best way of doing it, but you can also go for another option. I have bullet points here, for example, as another possibility. At the end of the day, what matters is transparency, that I, as a reader, but actually every reader, after all these words and complicated things and lots of information that you provide in your literature review, at the end of the analytical framework, I want to see, okay, this is the bottom line. This is what she or he wants to do. And I need to understand that, okay? So choose a form that helps me doing so. All right, that was it for the analytical framework. Thank you very much, as usual, for your attention. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully for another short lecture in our series on how to write an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Goodbye.